A Night Alone in the Forest. A true hiking story. It was a late summer afternoon when I decided to embark on what seemed like a simple solo hike. The trail was one I had taken before, familiar enough that I didn't think twice about the adventure ahead. The forest was my sanctuary, a place where the pressures of daily life melted away into the soothing sounds of nature. Armed with my backpack, a water bottle, and a vague plan, I set out with the sun still high in the sky, completely unaware of what the night would hold. The trail started easy, a gentle slope that wound through the tall pine trees. The sun filtered through the canopy, casting dappled shadows on the ground. The air was crisp, filled with the earthy scent of pine needles and moss. I found myself breathing deeply, letting the natural beauty seep into my soul. As I walked, I lost track of time, immersed in the rhythm of my steps and the rustling leaves. But as the hours passed, the sky began to change, and the once golden sunlight turned to a deep orange hue. The shadows grew longer, and a sense of urgency settled over me. I glanced at my watch, 5:30 p.m. I knew I had at least 2 more hours of daylight, but something inside me whispered that I should start heading back. The trail, however, had other plans. What was once a clear and well-marked path began to twist and turn in unexpected ways. Trees seemed to close in around me, and the trail became narrower, almost as if it were leading me deeper into the heart of the forest. I reassured myself that I could find my way back. After all, I had a decent sense of direction, but doubt began to creep in as I encountered forks in the trail that I didn't remember from previous hikes. The sun dipped below the horizon, and the forest was suddenly plunged into twilight. The chirping of birds gave way to the low hum of crickets, and the air grew colder. I pulled out my flashlight, its beam cutting through the growing darkness. The once comforting sounds of the forest now felt eerie, every rustle of leaves and snap of twigs making me jump. I kept moving, trying to find my way back to the main trail, but the further I walked, the more lost I felt. The trees, which had once felt like silent companions, now loomed like ominous figures in the dark. Panic started to rise in my chest. I was alone, with no cell service and no clear idea of where I was. As night fully descended, I made the decision to stop. Continuing to wander in the dark would only make things worse. I found a small clearing, just big enough to lay down my sleeping bag. I set up camp, using the limited supplies I had brought. The forest around me was alive with sounds. Owls hooting in the distance, the rustling of leaves as nocturnal creatures began their night, and the occasional snap of a branch that made my heart race. I tried to calm myself, focusing on the task at hand. I gathered some dry leaves and branches and managed to start a small fire. The warmth and light were a comfort, but it did little to ease the unease gnawing at the back of my mind. I sat by the fire, trying to make sense of my situation. My thoughts raced. How had I gotten so lost? Why hadn't I turned back sooner? What if I couldn't find my way out? As the fire crackled and the night grew colder, I wrapped myself in my sleeping bag, lying down next to the dwindling flames. The forest was a different place at night. The sounds of the day had vanished, replaced by an almost deafening silence. I could hear my own heartbeat thudding in my ears. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves, sent a jolt of fear through me. My mind conjured images of wild animals, of things lurking just beyond the reach of the firelight. I tried to sleep, but it was impossible. The cold ground was unforgiving, and every time I closed my eyes, the darkness seemed to press in on me. The forest, which had felt like a friend in the daylight, now seemed like a vast, unknowable entity. The trees that had once been so familiar were now shadows in the dark, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands. The hours passed slowly, each minute stretching into eternity. I must have drifted off at some point, but it was a restless sleep, filled with strange dreams and half-heard sounds. I woke with a start to the sound of something moving nearby. My heart raced as I fumbled for my flashlight, shining it into the darkness. The beam caught nothing but trees and shadows. Whatever had made the noise was gone, or perhaps it had never been there at all. I lay back down, staring up at the canopy of trees. The stars peeked through the gaps in the leaves, a reminder that I wasn't completely alone. But the vastness of the night sky only served to make me feel smaller, more insignificant. I was just one person, lost in an endless sea of trees and darkness. The night dragged on, each minute a test of my resolve. I alternated between trying to sleep and staring into the darkness, my mind playing tricks on me, creating monsters out of shadows. The fire had long since died out, leaving me alone in the cold and the dark. Finally, the first light of dawn began to filter through the trees. The darkness slowly receded, replaced by a pale gray light. The forest was still, as if holding its breath, waiting for the day to fully arrive. I felt a wave of relief wash over me as the sun began to rise, the familiar colors of the forest returning with the daylight. With the sun now peeking over the horizon, I packed up my things and began to walk, determined to find my way back. The forest, which had been so menacing in the dark, now seemed welcoming again. The trail, which had been hidden in shadows, became clear in the morning light. After what felt like hours of walking, I finally found the main trail. Relief flooded through me as I recognized the familiar markers. I had made it through the night, alone in the forest. The experience had shaken me, but it had also taught me something valuable about myself, about my ability to persevere, to face fear and uncertainty, and come out on the other side. When I finally emerged from the forest, tired and hungry, I felt a sense of accomplishment. I had faced the unknown and survived. The forest, once a place of fear, had become a place of strength. As I walked back to my car, the memories of the night before began to fade, replaced by the warmth of the sun and the knowledge that I had made it through the night alone in the forest. Part 2: A Night Alone in the Forest. A true hiking story. It was one of those days when the weight of the world seemed too heavy to bear. Work had been relentless, and the city's constant noise felt suffocating. I longed for an escape, a retreat into the arms of nature where the only sounds were the whispering wind and the songs of birds. That's when I decided to take a solo hike. The idea of being alone in the forest, surrounded by towering trees and the soothing hum of the wilderness, was irresistibly appealing. Little did I know, this hike would turn into one of the most harrowing experiences of my life. The trail I chose was known for its beauty, a path that meandered through dense woods and up gentle hills, offering breathtaking views of the landscape. I had hiked parts of it before, but never the full loop, which was said to take about 4 to 5 hours. It seemed manageable. I packed lightly, bringing only the essentials, some snacks, a bottle of water, a flashlight, and my phone, which I expected would serve as my guide if I veered off course. I didn't even think to bring a map. The confidence of familiarity, it turns out, can be dangerously misleading. I set out around 2 p.m., the sun high in the sky, casting a warm glow over the forest. The trees stood tall and proud, their leaves rustling softly in the breeze. The first hour was pure bliss. The rhythmic crunch of leaves underfoot and the occasional rustle of a small animal darting through the underbrush were the only sounds. I felt a deep sense of peace, my worries melting away with each step. The forest had that effect, a way of making everything else seem distant and unimportant. But as I'd ventured deeper into the woods, the trail began to change. What had started as a wide, well-marked path slowly narrowed, the trees closing in around me. I noticed fewer trail markers, and the once clear trail began to split into smaller, less defined paths. I hesitated at each fork, trying to remember the directions I had seen online. But memory is a fickle thing, especially when you're alone in unfamiliar territory. By the time I realized I was lost, it was already late afternoon. The shadows had grown longer, the sun dipping closer to the horizon. I tried to retrace my steps, but every path I took seemed unfamiliar, leading me deeper into the dense forest. The comforting sounds of nature began to take on a more ominous tone. The rustling leaves now sounded like whispers, the snapping twigs like footsteps. My heart started to pound in my chest as the reality of my situation set in. I took out my phone, hoping to find my location and get back on track. But the screen flashed a no signal message, the bars mocking my reliance on technology. Panic started to creep in, a cold wave that spread from my chest to my limbs. I knew the dangers of being lost in the forest after dark. Temperatures could drop rapidly, and the dense foliage could disorient even the most experienced hikers. But I forced myself to stay calm, reminding myself that I was prepared. I had my flashlight and some supplies. I just needed to find the right path. As the last light of day faded, I came across a small stream. The water was clear, trickling over smooth stones, and I followed it, thinking it might lead me back to a main trail. But the stream led me deeper into the forest, and soon I was surrounded by nothing but trees and darkness. The last rays of sunlight disappeared, and the forest was plunged into a deep, almost tangible blackness. I switched on my flashlight, its beam cutting through the dark, but only illuminating a small circle of the world around me. The once vibrant forest now felt like a different world, cold and uninviting. The tall trees that had seemed so majestic in the daylight now loomed over me like silent sentinels, their branches twisting into unsettling shapes. Every sound was amplified: the croak of a frog, the distant hoot of an owl, the rustle of leaves in the wind. My imagination began to run wild, conjuring images of wild animals or worse, unseen eyes watching me from the shadows. I knew that continuing to walk blindly in the dark was a bad idea. I needed to stay put, conserve my energy, and wait for daylight. I found a small clearing by the stream, where the ground was relatively flat, and decided to set up camp for the night. I gathered some dray branches and leaves, trying to start a fire, but the wood was damp, and my matches refused to catch. Frustration mounted as the cold began to seep in, the warmth of the day quickly dissipating in the night air. Eventually, I gave up on the fire and huddled into my sleeping bag, which offered little protection against the chill. The forest around me was alive with sounds, each one more unnerving than the last. I tried to focus on my breathing, slowing it down, telling myself that I would be okay, that morning would come soon. But the darkness was oppressive, the silence between the noises almost deafening. As I lay there, staring up at the canopy of trees, the reality of my situation sank in. I was alone, truly alone, in the middle of a vast forest with no clear way out. The confidence I had felt earlier in the day was gone, replaced by a gnawing fear. I realized how unprepared I was, how I had underestimated the power of nature. The forest was not just a place of beauty, it was wild, untamed, and indifferent to my presence. Sleep was impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, the darkness seemed to close in around me, the sounds of the night growing louder. My mind played tricks on me, turning the creak of a tree branch into the growl of a predator, the rustling leaves into the approach of something unseen. I clutched my flashlight like a lifeline, its beam my only defense against the unknown. Hours passed in a blur of anxiety and exhaustion. I lost track of time, my thoughts becoming a jumbled mess of fear and regret. Why hadn't I told someone exactly where I was going? Why hadn't I brought a map or checked my phone signal earlier? These questions ran through my mind, but there were no answers, only the cold, hard truth that I was lost and alone. At some point, I must have dozed off, though I didn't realize it until I was jolted awake by a loud snap nearby. My heart raced as I sat up, shining my flashlight around wildly. The beam caught nothing but trees and underbrush, but the sound had been real, not a figment of my imagination. I stayed awake, too scared to sleep, my ears straining for any sign of danger. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the first light of dawn began to filter through the trees. The darkness slowly lifted, replaced by a soft, grey light that brought with it a glimmer of hope. The forest, which had been so menacing in the dark, began to take on its familiar form again. The trees, the stream, the trail, they were all still there, unchanged, as if the night's terror had been a bad dream. With the rising sun, my fear began to fade, replaced by a determination to find my way out. I packed up my things, my body stiff from the cold and lack of sleep, and started walking. The trail was still difficult to follow, but in the daylight, it was easier to navigate. I kept the stream to my left, hoping it would lead me back to civilization. After several hours of walking, I finally stumbled upon a familiar landmark, a large, moss-covered rock that I remembered passing earlier in the day. Relief washed over me as I realized I was back on the main trail. The path was still long, but I knew where I was, and more importantly, I knew how to get back. When I finally emerged from the forest, the sun was high in the sky, and the world was bright and warm again. I was exhausted, both physically and mentally, but the sense of relief was overwhelming. I had spent a night alone in the forest, faced my fears, and come out the other side. The experience had been terrifying, but it had also taught me valuable lessons about preparation, respect for nature, and my own inner strength. As I drove away from the trailhead, I glanced back at the forest, its trees towering over the landscape like silent guardians. I knew I would return someday, but next time, I would be better prepared. The forest, for all its beauty and serenity, was not a place to be taken lightly. It was wild, unpredictable, and full of secrets, some of which I had glimpsed during that long, dark night. Part 3: A Night Alone in the Forest. A true hiking story. The decision to hike alone in the forest had been a spontaneous one, born out of a desire to disconnect from the chaos of daily life and reconnect with something more primal, more real. The forest had always been a place of solace for me, a living, breathing entity that seemed to pulse with a rhythm all its own. I had always felt a deep connection to nature, and the idea of spending a night alone in the wilderness seemed like the perfect way to reset, to find that inner calm that had been eluding me for so long. The day started off perfectly. The weather was ideal for hiking, not too hot, with a gentle breeze that kept the air fresh and cool. I had packed lightly, bringing only the essentials: water, a few energy bars, a flashlight, and a lightweight sleeping bag. I hadn't planned on staying overnight, but I knew that if I lost track of time, I could make do with what I had. The forest was familiar to me, a place I had visited many times, though I had never ventured so deep into its heart alone. As I walked, the forest seemed to welcome me with open arms. The sun filtered through the leaves, casting a warm, golden light that danced on the forest floor. The scent of pine and earth filled the air, and the only sounds were the rustling of leaves and the occasional call of a bird. I felt at peace, my mind clearing with each step. The worries and stresses of everyday life seemed to melt away, replaced by a deep sense of contentment. The trail wound through dense undergrowth and up gentle inclines, offering stunning views of the surrounding landscape. Every now and then, I would stop to take in the scenery, marveling at the way the light played on the trees, the way the forest seemed to stretch out endlessly in every direction. There was a timeless quality to the woods, a sense that this place had existed long before I had arrived and would continue to exist long after I had gone. As the afternoon wore on, I found myself venturing further and further from the main trail. The allure of the unknown was too strong to resist. I followed a narrow path that led deeper into the forest, away from the more well-trodden routes. The trees grew taller and thicker here, their branches intertwining to form a dense canopy overhead. The light grew dimmer, the air cooler, but I was undeterred. There was something exhilarating about the isolation, about being so completely alone in the heart of the wilderness. The first sign of trouble came as the sun began its descent. I hadn't realized how late it was, how far I had wandered. The trail I was on had become less defined, more of a suggestion than a path. I tried to retrace my steps, but the forest, so welcoming in the daylight, now seemed to conspire against me. The trees, once so familiar, now looked identical, their trunks and branches blending into a maze of green and brown. Every direction looked the same, and the trail markers I had been following had disappeared altogether. Panic set in slowly, creeping up on me like the shadows that lengthened across the forest floor. I checked my phone, but as expected, there was no signal. The realization that I was truly lost, miles from civilization, alone in the rapidly darkening woods, sent a shiver down my spine. But I pushed the fear down, focusing on what I could control. I still had daylight, I told myself. I could find my way back if I kept moving, if I stayed calm. But the forest had other plans. As the last light of day faded, the world around me was swallowed by darkness. The trees, once so majestic, now seemed to close in on me, their branches like the gnarled fingers of some ancient creature. The air grew colder, and the sounds of the forest took on a more sinister tone. The gentle rustling of leaves became a menacing whisper, the distant calls of birds now seemed like warnings. I fumbled for my flashlight, its beam piercing the darkness but offering little comfort. The light revealed only more trees, more shadows, more of the same dense, impenetrable forest. Every step I took seemed to lead me further into the unknown, the path twisting and turning in ways I didn't recognize. I was lost, truly and completely lost, and the realization hit me like a punch to the gut. I decided to stop moving. Wandering aimlessly in the dark was only going to make things worse. I found a small clearing, just large enough to sit down and gather my thoughts. I had brought a sleeping bag, but I hadn't expected to use it out here, alone in the wilderness. I unrolled it on the ground, trying to make myself as comfortable as possible, but the ground was hard and cold, and the night air seemed to seep through the fabric, chilling me to the bone. The forest at night was a different world. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant cry of an animal. Every sound made me jump, my nerves frayed by the unfamiliarity of it all. I tried to focus on my breathing, to calm myself, but it was impossible. My mind raced with thoughts of what could be out there in the dark, what could be watching me from the shadows. Hours passed in a blur of fear and exhaustion. I must have drifted off at some point, but my sleep was fitful, plagued by nightmares and the cold that seemed to sink into my very bones. I woke repeatedly, each time with a start, the darkness around me unchanged. The night seemed endless, stretching on and on with no sign of morning. At one point, I thought I heard footsteps, soft, barely there, but unmistakable. My heart leaped into my throat as I sat up, shining my flashlight in every direction, but there was nothing. Only the trees, only the shadows. I tried to convince myself that it was just my imagination, that the forest was playing tricks on me, but the fear was real, and it was all-consuming. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I saw the first hint of dawn. A pale light began to seep through the trees, chasing away the darkness. The forest, so terrifying in the night, began to look familiar again, the shapes and shadows taking on the forms of trees and bushes. The night was over, but the memory of it clung to me like a second skin. As soon as there was enough light to see by, I packed up my things and started walking. I didn't know where I was, but the daylight gave me the courage to keep moving. The fear that had paralyzed me in the night was replaced by a steely determination. I was going to find my way out, no matter how long it took. The forest, now bathed in the soft light of morning, was beautiful again. The birds were singing, the trees swaying gently in the breeze, as if nothing had happened, as if the night had been a bad dream. But I knew it hadn't been. The fear, the isolation, the utter helplessness I had felt, those were real. They had changed me in some fundamental way, making me realize just how small I was in the grand scheme of things, how easily the world could turn from a place of solace to a place of terror. After hours of walking, I finally found the main trail. The sight of it filled me with a joy that was almost overwhelming. I had made it. I was safe. The fear that had gripped me all night began to melt away, replaced by a profound sense of relief and gratitude. The forest, for all its beauty and mystery, was not something to be taken lightly. It was a living, breathing entity, one that demanded respect and caution. When I finally emerged from the forest, the sun was high in the sky, and the world was bright and warm again. I was exhausted, both physically and mentally, but I had survived. The experience had shaken me to my core, but it had also taught me something invaluable. The forest was a place of beauty, yes, but also of danger. It was a place where the line between the known and the unknown was thin, where the light of day could be replaced by the darkness of night in the blink of an eye. As I walked back to my car, I couldn't help but look back at the forest one last time. It stood there, silent and unchanged, as if waiting for the next person to venture into its depths. I knew I would return someday, but I would do so with a newfound respect for the wilderness, for the power of nature, and for the strength I had found within myself during that long, lonely night in the forest. Part 4: A Night Alone in the Forest. A true hiking story. The decision to embark on a solo hike in the forest was an impulse, one that came on the heels of a particularly stressful week. The forest had always been a refuge, a place where the noise of the world faded into the background, and the only sounds were the wind in the trees and the birds calling to one another. It had always felt like a safe space, a place where I could think clearly and breathe deeply. But this time, the forest would test me in ways I had never imagined. The day began like many others. The sky was clear, a soft blue that seemed to stretch on forever, with just a few wisps of clouds drifting lazily across it. The air was cool and crisp, carrying the scent of pine and earth. I packed my bag with the essentials: water, snacks, a flashlight, and a map that I barely glanced at, confident that I knew the way. I wasn't planning on staying overnight, but as always, I liked to be prepared. The trailhead was familiar, one I had visited many times before. It started off wide and well-marked, winding gently through a mix of pine and oak trees. The ground was soft underfoot, a carpet of fallen leaves and pine needles that muffled my steps. As I walked, I felt the tension in my body begin to ease, my mind clearing with each step. The forest was quiet, peaceful, the kind of quiet that wraps around you like a comforting blanket. For the first few hours, the hike was everything I had hoped it would be. The trail led me deeper into the forest, away from the noise and distractions of the outside world. The only sounds were the rustling of leaves in the breeze and the occasional call of a distant bird. I found myself smiling, the worries of the week melting away with each step. There was something magical about being alone in the forest, something that made everything else seem small and insignificant. But as the afternoon wore on, I found myself venturing further than I had planned. The trail, once wide and easy to follow, began to narrow, the trees closing in around me. The sun was still high in the sky, but the light filtering through the canopy was growing dimmer, the shadows longer. I didn't think much of it at first, too caught up in the beauty of the forest to notice the subtle changes in my surroundings. It wasn't until I reached a small clearing, where the trail seemed to split into several smaller parts, that I realized I was lost. I paused, looking around, trying to remember which way I had come. The forest, so familiar just hours ago, now seemed foreign, the trees all looking the same, the paths indistinguishable from one another. I checked my phone, but there was no signal. A small amount of anxiety formed in my stomach, but I pushed it down. I had been in the forest many times before. I could find my way back. I chose a path at random, hoping it would lead me back to the main trail. But as I walked, the forest grew denser, the trees taller and closer together. The path became less distinct, more like a game trail than a hiking path. The light was fading faster now, the sun sinking lower in the sky. The sense of unease that had been a small knot in my stomach was now a tight ball of fear. I stopped again, trying to get my bearings. The forest was silent around me, the stillness unsettling. I took out my map, but it was little help. The paths I had taken didn't seem to match up with anything on the map, and the landmarks were unfamiliar. The trees seemed to be closing in on me, the shadows growing longer, the air colder. Panic began to set in, my mind racing as I realized just how lost I was. The sun dipped below the horizon, and the forest was suddenly plunged into twilight. I fumbled for my flashlight, switching it on as the last light of day faded away. The beam cut through the darkness, but it only illuminated a small circle of the world around me. Everything beyond that circle was pitch black, the trees looming like dark, faceless giants. The forest that had felt so welcoming just hours ago now seemed menacing, the silence oppressive. I kept walking, hoping to find something familiar, but every direction looked the same. The fear that had been building inside me was now full-blown panic. I was alone, truly alone, in the middle of a vast forest with no idea how to get out. I tried to stay calm, to focus on finding my way, but the darkness and the cold were relentless, pressing in on me from all sides. Eventually, I realized that I wasn't going to find my way out in the dark. I needed to stop, to conserve my energy and wait for daylight. I found a small clearing and set up a makeshift camp. I spread out my sleeping bag on the ground, the cold earth seeping through the thin fabric. I tried to build a fire, but the wood was too damp, and my attempts were futile. I gave up, wrapping myself in the sleeping bag and huddling against the cold. The night was long and terrifying. The forest was alive with sounds, rustling leaves, snapping twigs, the distant call of an owl. Every noise made my heart race, my mind conjuring images of wild animals or worse. The darkness was complete, the flashlight's beam the only thing keeping the terror at bay. I lay there, unable to sleep, staring into the darkness, my mind racing with thoughts of how I had ended up here. At some point during the night, I heard something moving nearby. The sound was faint, barely audible over the pounding of my heart, but it was there. I sat up, clutching the flashlight, its beam shaking as I tried to find the source of the noise. But there was nothing, just the endless rows of trees and the shadows that seemed to move just out of the corner of my eye. I told myself it was just my imagination, that I was alone out here, but the fear was overwhelming. I must have dozed off at some point, but my sleep was fitful, filled with nightmares and the cold that seemed to seep into my bones. I woke several times during the night, each time to the same oppressive darkness and the sounds of the forest. The hours dragged on, each minute feeling like an eternity, the fear never leaving, never allowing me a moment of peace. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the first light of dawn began to filter through the trees. The darkness lifted, replaced by a soft, grey light that brought with it a sense of hope. The forest, so terrifying in the night, began to take on its familiar form again. The trees were just trees, the shadows just shadows. The terror of the night began to fade, replaced by a determination to find my way out. With the first light of morning, I packed up my things and started walking. The trail was still difficult to follow, but the daylight made it easier to navigate. I kept moving, driven by the need to get out of the forest, to put the night behind me. The fear was still there, a lingering echo of the terror I had felt in the dark, but it was manageable now, something I could push aside as I focused on finding my way. After several hours of walking, I finally found the main trail. Relief washed over me as I recognized the familiar markers, the path leading back to where I had started. The forest, for all its beauty and danger, had let me go. I had survived the night, faced my fears, and come out the other side. When I finally emerged from the forest, the sun was high in the sky, and the world was bright and warm again. I was exhausted, both physically and mentally, but I had made it through the night. The experience had changed me, made me realize just how small and fragile we are in the grand scheme of things. The forest, for all its beauty and serenity, was a place of raw power, a place where the line between life and death was thin. As I drove away from the trailhead, I looked back at the forest, its trees towering over the landscape, silent and unchanging. I knew I would return someday, but I would do so with a newfound respect for the wilderness, for the power of nature, and for the strength I had found within myself during that long, terrifying night alone in the forest. The experience had been harrowing, but it had also been a lesson. A reminder that nature is not something to be taken lightly, that it demands respect and humility from those who venture into its depths. Part 5: A Night Alone in the Forest. A true hiking story. There's something about the allure of the forest that draws you in, a pull that's both mysterious and comforting. The way the trees stand tall and unwavering, the leaves rustling like whispers from ancient times, and the scent of the earth, rich and fertile, all seem to promise peace. It was that promise that led me to the forest that day, seeking a break from the relentless demands of life. But the forest, while beautiful, holds its own secrets, secrets that would unravel before me as I spent a night alone in its depths. The morning started out like any other. I had planned the hike on a whim, a decision made after glancing at the clear skies and feeling the crispness of the air. It was perfect hiking weather, and I yearned for the solitude that only nature could provide. I packed my bag lightly, just the essentials. After all, I had been on this trail before. It was familiar, almost like an old friend, and I felt no need to over-prepare. The forest had always been kind to me. As I set out, the world around me seemed to breathe with life. The path was wide and well-trodden, lined with towering pines that swayed gently in the breeze. The sun shone down through the canopy, casting a warm, dappled light on the forest floor. Birds sang their song high above, and I found myself humming along, lost in the rhythm of the hike. The stresses of the week began to fade away, replaced by the simple joy of being alone in nature. For the first few hours, the hike was everything I had hoped it would be. The trail wound through the forest, climbing gradually until it opened up to a stunning view of the valley below. I stood there for a while, breathing in the fresh air, feeling the wind on my face, and marveling at the beauty of the landscape. It was moments like this that made the effort worth it, that reminded me why I love the forest so much. But as the day wore on, I found myself venturing deeper into the woods than I had planned. The trail became less defined, the trees closer together, their branches intertwining overhead, blocking out more and more of the sunlight. The air grew cooler, and I noticed the shadows growing longer. I glanced at my watch and realized with a start that it was already late afternoon. Time had slipped away from me, as it often does when you're engrossed in the beauty of nature. I turned back, intending to retrace my steps, but the path I had taken seemed to have disappeared. The trail markers were nowhere to be seen, and every direction looked the same, endless trees, their trunks dark and foreboding in the dim light. I felt the first twinge of unease, a small knot of anxiety forming in my chest. But I pushed it aside, telling myself that I knew this forest, that I could find my way back. I picked a direction and started walking, hoping to find the main trail again. But the further I went, the more disoriented I became. The forest, once so welcoming, now felt like a labyrinth, each turn leading me deeper into its heart. The light was fading fast, the sky above turning from blue to a dusky orange as the sun dipped toward the horizon. My footsteps quickened, driven by a growing sense of urgency. I needed to get out of the woods before nightfall. But it was no use. The forest seemed to shift around me, the trees closing in, the path becoming more treacherous with each step. I stumbled over roots and rocks, the underbrush growing thicker, snagging at my clothes. The birds that had filled the forest with song were now silent, replaced by the low hum of insects and the distant rustling of leaves. The world around me was changing, becoming something darker, more menacing. By the time I realized I was truly lost, the sun had almost disappeared, leaving the forest bathed in the eerie half-light of dusk. Panic began to set in, my heart pounding in my chest. I took out my phone, but as I had feared, there was no signal. The map I had brought was useless. The landmarks I had seen earlier were nowhere to be found. The forest was a maze, and I was trapped in it, with no clear way out. As the last light of day faded, I was plunged into darkness. I fumbled for my flashlight, my hands shaking as I switched it on. The beam cut through the night, but it did little to dispel the fear that gripped me. The forest had transformed, the once familiar trees now looming like silent sentinels, their branches twisting into grotesque shapes. The sounds of the forest had changed too, becoming sharper, more ominous. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig sent a jolt of terror through me. I knew I couldn't keep wandering in the dark. I needed to stop, to conserve my energy and wait for morning. I found a small clearing and set up camp using the few supplies I had. I unrolled my sleeping bag on the cold, hard ground and huddled inside it, trying to find some semblance of warmth. The night air was bitter, the cold seeping through the fabric and into my bones. I tried to start a fire, but the wood was damp and my attempts were futile. The darkness was complete, the forest around me a wall of blackness. The night was long, each minute stretching into eternity. The forest was alive with sounds, each one more terrifying than the last. The wind whispered through the trees, carrying with it the distant howl of some unknown creature. The rustling of leaves became the footsteps of something unseen, something lurking just beyond the reach of my flashlight. I lay there, my eyes wide open, too afraid to sleep, my mind conjuring images of wild animals, of creatures born of the dark. At some point, I must have drifted off, though it was a fitful, restless sleep. I woke several times, each time to the same oppressive darkness, the same sounds of the forest. The fear was unrelenting, a constant companion in the night. I had never felt so alone, so vulnerable. The forest, which had once been a place of peace, had become a place of fear, a place where the line between reality and nightmare blurred. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the first light of dawn began to filter through the trees. The darkness lifted, replaced by a soft, grey light that brought with it a sense of relief. The forest, so terrifying in the night, began to take on its familiar form again. The trees were just trees, the shadows just shadows. The terror of the night began to fade, replaced by a determination to find my way out. I packed up my things and started walking as soon as there was enough light to see. The trail was still difficult to follow, but the daylight made it easier to navigate. The fear that had gripped me during the night was still there, but it was tempered by the knowledge that I was no longer in complete darkness, that I could find my way back. After hours of walking, I finally found the main trail. Relief washed over me as I recognized the familiar markers, the path leading back to where I had started. The forest had let me go. I had survived the night, faced my fears, and come out the other side. When I finally emerged from the forest, the sun was high in the sky, and the world was bright and warm again. I was exhausted, both physically and mentally, but I had made it through the night. The experience had changed me, made me realize just how small and fragile we are in the grand scheme of things. The forest, for all its beauty and serenity, was a place of raw power, a place where the line between life and death was thin. As I drove away from the trailhead, I couldn't help but look back at the forest one last time. It stood there, silent and unchanged, as if waiting for the next person to venture into its depths. I knew I would return someday, but I would do so with a newfound respect for the wilderness, for the power of nature, and for the strength I had found within myself during that long, terrifying night alone in the forest. The experience had been harrowing, but it had also been a lesson. A reminder that nature is not something to be taken lightly, that it demands respect and humility from those who venture into its depths. The forest is beautiful, but it is also wild, and in that wildness lies both danger and wonder. Part 6: A Night Alone in the Forest. A true hiking story. The allure of the forest is something that has always captivated me. There's a certain mystery in the way the trees stand tall and ancient, their branches intertwining like the fingers of giants. The forest whispers secrets, ones that only the wind and the animals understand. I had always found comfort in those whispers, a sense of peace that was hard to find anywhere else. But the forest is also a place where the line between safety and danger is thin, a lesson I learned all too well on that fateful night. It began as an ordinary day. I had been feeling restless, a sense of unease gnawing at me that I couldn't quite shake. The forest, I thought, would be the perfect remedy. A day spent among the trees, away from the noise and pressure of the city, was exactly what I needed. I packed a small bag, just the essentials as I always did. I knew the trail well, having hiked it many times before. There was no reason to think this day would be any different. As I set out, the sun was just beginning to rise, casting a golden light through the trees. The world was waking up, and the forest was alive with the sounds of birds and the rustling of leaves. The trail was familiar, the path well worn by my footsteps and those of countless other hikers. There was a comfort in the routine of it, in the way the forest seemed to welcome me back like an old friend. The hours passed quickly as I walked deeper into the woods. The trail led me through dense patches of trees and up gentle slopes, offering glimpses of the landscape below. The air was cool and crisp, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. I felt a sense of contentment, the worries of the week fading into the background as the forest wrapped me in its embrace. But as the afternoon wore on, I found myself venturing further than I had intended. The trail, which had been so clear and easy to follow, began to narrow and twist in unexpected ways. The trees grew closer together, their branches forming a canopy that blocked out much of the sunlight. The forest, which had felt so welcoming just hours ago, began to feel more imposing, the shadows lengthening as the day wore on. It was then that I realized I had lost my way. The trail markers, which had been so frequent earlier, were nowhere to be found. I stopped, looking around, trying to get my bearings, but everything looked the same, endless rows of trees stretching out in every direction. The sense of unease that had been lurking at the edge of my consciousness now came rushing to the forefront. I was lost, deep in the heart of the forest, and the daylight was fading fast. I took out my phone, hoping to use its GPS to find my way back, but there was no signal. The realization hit me like a cold wave. I was alone, with no way to contact anyone, no way to find my way out except by my own instincts. I tried to stay calm, reminding myself that I had been in the forest many times before, that I could find my way back. But the fear was there, gnawing at the edges of my mind. I chose a direction and started walking, hoping to stumble upon the main trail. But the further I went, the more disoriented I became. The forest seemed to close in around me, the trees towering overhead like silent sentinels. The light was fading quickly now, the sky above turning from blue to a deep, dusky orange. Panic began to set in as I realized just how lost I was. As the last light of day faded, I was plunged into darkness. I fumbled for my flashlight, switching it on with shaking hands. The beam cut through the night, but it only illuminated a small circle of the world around me. Everything beyond that circle was pitch black, the trees looming like dark, faceless giants. The forest, once so familiar, had transformed into something alien, something menacing. I knew I couldn't keep wandering in the dark. I needed to stop, to conserve my energy, and wait for the morning light. I found a small clearing, just large enough to lay down my sleeping bag and set up a makeshift camp. The ground was cold and unforgiving, the air growing colder with each passing minute. I tried to start a fire, but the wood was too damp, and my matches were nearly spent. After several failed attempts, I gave up, resigning myself to a long, cold night. The darkness was absolute, pressing in on me from all sides. The forest was alive with sounds, rustling leaves, snapping twigs, the distant hoot of an owl. Every noise made me jump, my heart pounding in my chest. my mind conjured images of wild animals, of unseen predators lurking just beyond the reach of my flashlight's beam. I tried to calm myself, to focus on my breathing, but the fear was relentless, a constant, gnawing presence in the back of my mind. Hours passed in a blur of fear and exhaustion. I must have dozed off at some point, but my sleep was fitful, plagued by nightmares and the cold that seemed to seep into my very bones. I woke several times during the night, each time to the same oppressive darkness and the sounds of the forest. The fear was all-consuming, a presence that clung to me like a second skin. At one point, I heard something moving in the underbrush nearby. The sound was faint, barely audible over the pounding of my heart, but it was there. I sat up, shining my flashlight in the direction of the noise, but there was nothing, only the trees, only the darkness. I told myself it was just my imagination, that the forest was playing tricks on me, but the fear was real, and it was overwhelming. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the first light of dawn began to filter through the trees. The darkness lifted, replaced by a soft, grey light that brought with it a sense of relief. The forest, so terrifying in the night, began to take on its familiar form again. The trees were just trees, the shadows just shadows. The terror of the night began to fade, replaced by a determination to find my way out. With the first light of morning, I packed up my things and started walking. The trail was still difficult to follow, but the daylight made it easier to navigate. The fear that had gripped me during the night was still there, but it was tempered by the knowledge that I was no longer in complete darkness, that I could find my way back. After several hours of walking, I finally stumbled upon the main trail. Relief washed over me as I recognized the familiar markers, the path leading back to where I had started. The forest had let me go. I had survived the night, faced my fears, and come out the other side. When I finally emerged from the forest, the sun was high in the sky, and the world was bright and warm again. I was exhausted, both physically and mentally, but I had made it through the night. The experience had changed me, made me realize just how small and fragile we are in the grand scheme of things. The forest, for all its beauty and serenity, was a place of raw power, a place where the line between life and death was thin. As I drove away from the trailhead, I couldn't help but look back at the forest one last time. It stood there, silent and unchanged, as if waiting for the next person to venture into its depths. I knew I would return someday, but I would do so with a newfound respect for the wilderness, for the power of nature, and for the strength I had found within myself during that long, terrifying night alone in the forest. The experience had been harrowing, but it had also been a lesson. A reminder that nature is not something to be taken lightly, that it demands respect and humility from those who venture into its depths. The forest is beautiful, yes, but it is also wild, and it is in that wildness that its true power lies. Part 7: A Night Alone in the Forest. A true hiking story. The idea of spending a night alone in the forest had always held a certain appeal for me. There was something inherently alluring about the thought of disconnecting from the modern world, of stepping into a place where time moved more slowly, where the only sounds were the whispers of the wind through the trees and the distant calls of animals. It was a place where one could find solitude and peace, where the worries of daily life could be left behind. But the forest, I would soon discover, was also a place where the thin veneer of safety could easily be stripped away, revealing the raw, untamed wildness beneath. The day I set out was like many others, a desire to escape the routine and immerse myself in nature. The weather was perfect for a hike, cool but not cold, with the sun shining brightly in a clear blue sky. I had hiked the forest trails many times before, and I knew them well. Also, I thought, I packed my bag lightly, as I wasn't planning to stay out overnight. Just the essentials, some water, a few snacks, my flashlight, and a small first aid kit. I didn't think I would need anything more. The trailhead was bustling with activity as I began my hike, families with young children, couples holding hands, and solo hikers like myself, all eager to enjoy the beauty of the forest. I greeted a few fellow hikers as I passed, but I was eager to leave the more crowded paths behind and venture into the quieter, less traveled areas of the woods. The forest had always felt like a sanctuary to me, a place where I could truly be alone with my thoughts. As I walked, the forest seemed to wrap itself around me, the tall trees forming a protective canopy overhead. The light filtering through the leaves created a dappled pattern on the ground, and the air was filled with the scent of pine and damp earth. I felt my mind begin to clear, the stress and noise of the outside world fading away with each step. The trail wound through the trees, sometimes climbing gently, sometimes descending into cool, shaded hollows. I was in no hurry, content to let the day unfold at its own pace. By mid-afternoon, I had ventured deeper into the forest than I had planned. The trail had narrowed, becoming little more than a footpath through the underbrush. The trees grew closer together here, their branches forming a dense web that blocked out much of the sunlight. The air was cooler and the shadows longer. I paused to check my map, realizing with a start that I had wandered off the main trail. I wasn't worried. I had a good sense of direction, and I was confident I could find my way back. But as the afternoon wore on, the forest seemed to change. The light that had been so warm and inviting began to take on a different quality, the golden hues of late afternoon giving way to the deepening shadows of evening. The trail, which had been so clear, began to twist and turn, leading me further away from where I thought I needed to go. I began to feel a creeping sense of unease, a realization that I might not be as in control of my situation as I had believed. I decided to turn back, but as I retraced my steps, the landscape around me seemed unfamiliar. The trees, the rocks, the slight rises and falls of the terrain, none of it matched what I remembered. The forest, which had always felt like a friend, now seemed strange and alien, the parts I had taken obscured by shadows and doubt. I quickened my pace, hoping to find a familiar landmark, but the deeper I went, the more lost I became. The sun was sinking lower in the sky, casting long dark shadows across the forest floor. I checked my phone, hoping to use its GPS to find my location, but there was no signal. Panic began to bubble up inside me, but I forced it down. I needed to stay calm, to think clearly. I still had daylight, I told myself. I just needed to keep moving. But the forest had other plans. As the last light of day faded, the world around me was plunged into twilight. The trees, once so familiar and comforting, now loomed like dark sentinels, their branches twisting into ominous shapes. The trail I had been following seemed to disappear altogether, swallowed by the encroaching darkness. I turned on my flashlight, the beam piercing the gloom, but revealing little beyond more trees, more shadows. I knew then that I was in trouble. The forest was vast, and the darkness made it seem even larger, more impenetrable. Every direction looked the same, endless rows of trees stretching out into the night. The sounds of the forest, which had been so soothing during the day, now took on a different quality. The rustling of leaves became a sinister whisper, the snap of a twig a sharp, sudden intrusion that made my heart race. I needed to find a place to stop, to make camp for the night. Continuing to wander in the dark would only make things worse. I found a small clearing, just large enough to set up a makeshift shelter. I laid out my sleeping bag on the cold, hard ground and huddled inside it, trying to conserve my warmth. The night air was biting, and I could feel the cold seeping into my bones. I tried to start a fire, but the wood was damp, and my hands were shaking too much to get the kindling to catch. As the darkness closed in around me, I realized how truly alone I was. The forest was a different place at night, alive with sounds that I couldn't identify, filled with shadows that moved and shifted just beyond the reach of my flashlight's beam. Every noise made me jump, my mind conjuring images of wild animals, of creatures lurking in the dark. I tried to calm myself, to focus on the task at hand, but it was impossible. The fear was a constant, gnawing presence, a weight that pressed down on me from all sides. Hours passed in a blur of fear and exhaustion. I must have dozed off at some point, though I couldn't say for how long. My sleep was fitful, plagued by strange dreams and the cold that seemed to seep into every part of me. I woke repeatedly, each time to the same oppressive darkness, the same unsettling sounds of the forest. The fear was always there, lurking in the back of my mind, never letting me fully relax. At one point, I thought I heard footsteps, soft, barely audible, but unmistakable. My heart leaped into my throat as I sat up, shining my flashlight into the darkness. The beam caught nothing but trees and shadows. Whatever had made the noise was gone, or perhaps it had never been there at all. I tried to convince myself that it was just my imagination, that the forest was playing tricks on me, but the fear was real, and it was all-consuming. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the first light of dawn began to filter through the trees. The darkness slowly lifted, replaced by a pale grey light that brought with it a sense of relief. The forest, so menacing in the dark, began to look familiar again. The trees were just trees, the shadows just shadows. The terror of the night began to fade, replaced by a determination to find my way out. With the first light of morning, I packed up my things and started walking. The trail was still difficult to follow, but the daylight made it easier to navigate. The fear that had gripped me during the night was still there, but it was tempered by the knowledge that I was no longer in complete darkness, that I could find my way back. After several hours of walking, I finally stumbled upon the main trail. Relief washed over me as I recognized the familiar markers, the path leading back to where I had started. The forest had let me go. I had survived the night, faced my fears, and come out the other side. When I finally emerged from the forest, the sun was high in the sky, and the world was bright and warm again. I was exhausted, both physically and mentally, but I had made it through the night. The experience had changed me, made me realize just how small and fragile we are in the grand scheme of things. The forest, for all its beauty and serenity, was a place of raw power, a place where the line between life and death was thin. As I drove away from the trailhead, I couldn't help but look back at the forest one last time. It stood there, silent and unchanged, as if waiting for the next person to venture into its depths. I knew I would return someday, but I would do so with a newfound respect for the wilderness, for the power of nature, and for the strength I had found within myself during that long, terrifying night alone in the forest. The experience had been harrowing, but it had also been a lesson, a reminder that nature is not something to be taken lightly, that it demands respect and humility from those who venture into its depths. The forest is beautiful, yes, but it is also wild, and it is in that wildness that its true power lies. As the memories of that night have settled, I find myself reflecting on the thin line that separates us from the wild. It's easy to forget, in the comfort of our daily lives, just how vulnerable we are when we step outside the bounds of civilization. The forest reminded me of that vulnerability, of the primal fear that lurks within us all. It's a fear that we rarely have to confront, but when we do, it leaves an indelible mark. I think back to that night often, not with fear, but with a sense of respect. The forest showed me its true face, a face that is not always kind, but one that is honest and raw. It's a place that doesn't bend to human will, a place where nature reigns supreme. And in that, there is a kind of beauty, a reminder that we are part of something much larger than ourselves. The next time I venture into the forest, I will do so with more caution, more preparation. But I will also go with a deeper appreciation for the wildness that lies at the heart of nature. The forest is a place of peace and danger, of beauty and terror, and it is in that duality that its power resides. It's a power that I have come to respect, and one that I will never forget. Part 8. A Night Alone in the Forest. A true hiking story. The pull of the forest was something I could never quite explain. It was more than just a place of natural beauty. It was a realm where the ordinary rules of life seemed to pause, where the whisper of leaves in the wind could drown out the loudest of thoughts, and where the tangled roots underfoot anchored you to something ancient and enduring. The forest, to me, was a sanctuary, a living cathedral built over centuries, with towering trees for pillars and a canopy of green leaves as its vaulted ceiling. But what I hadn't fully realized until that night was that the forest could also be a place where your deepest fears come to life. That day had begun like many others, with the sun just peeking over the horizon, casting a soft, golden light across the landscape. I had been restless, feeling the familiar itch to get away, to escape the suffocating routines of everyday life. The forest called to me, as it often did, promising solitude and the chance to clear my mind. I packed a small bag with just the essentials, a water bottle, some snacks, my flashlight, and a lightweight jacket. I wasn't planning on staying overnight, but I liked to be prepared. The drive to the trailhead was peaceful, the early morning roads empty save for the occasional deer or rabbit darting across the pavement. When I arrived, the parking lot was nearly deserted, just the way I liked it. I stepped out of the car, breathed in the crisp morning air, and felt a sense of calm wash over me. This was what I needed, a day alone in the forest, away from everything. The trail started off wide and well-maintained, a familiar path that wound gently through the trees. The sun was still low in the sky, its rays filtering through the canopy and casting long shadows on the ground. The air was cool, and the forest was alive with the sounds of birds and insects, a symphony of life that seemed to welcome me back. I set off at a steady pace, letting the rhythm of my footsteps and the rustle of leaves guide my thoughts. As the morning wore on, I found myself drawn deeper into the woods, following a narrower, less trodden path that veered off from the main trail. The trees here were taller, older, their branches forming a thick canopy that blocked out much of the sunlight. The underbrush grew thicker, and the sounds of the forest seemed to change, softer, more muted, as if the very air was heavier. But I wasn't concerned. I had been in these woods many times before, and I felt at home here. By mid-afternoon, I realized that I had wandered farther than I had intended. The trail had become faint, more of a suggestion than a path, and the trees grew so close together that it was difficult to see more than a few feet ahead. The light had taken on a different quality, a kind of dimness that made everything look slightly unreal, as though the forest itself was holding its breath. I paused to get my bearings, pulling out my map and compass, but the landmarks didn't seem to match up with what I was seeing around me. A small prickle of unease began to stir in the back of my mind. I decided to turn back, but as I retraced my steps, the landscape seemed unfamiliar. The trees, the rocks, even the ground underfoot felt different somehow, as though the forest had shifted in subtle ways to confuse me. I quickened my pace, hoping to find a familiar landmark, but the deeper I went, the more lost I felt. The sun was starting to sink lower in the sky, casting long, eerie shadows across the forest floor. The sense of unease I had been feeling began to grow into something more like fear. I tried to stay calm, reminding myself that I had been in worse situations before, but the forest was beginning to close in around me. The trees, which had felt like silent guardians in the morning, now seemed like dark sentinels, watching me with indifferent eyes. The light was fading fast, and the air had turned cold, with a sharp edge that hinted at the coming night. I knew I needed to find my way out before the sun disappeared completely, but every direction looked the same, endless rows of trees stretching out into the gathering gloom. The last of the daylight faded, and with it any semblance of familiarity. I was alone, deep in the heart of the forest, with no clear idea of where I was or how to get back. I fumbled for my flashlight, its beam cutting through the darkness, but revealing only more trees, more shadows. The forest had transformed into something alien, something that felt hostile and unwelcoming. The sounds of the day, the birds, the rustling leaves, had been replaced by the low hum of insects and the occasional snap of a twig in the distance. Every noise made me jump, my heart pounding in my chest. I needed to stop, to find a place to wait out the night. Wandering in the dark would only lead me further into danger. I found a small clearing, just big enough to lay down my sleeping bag and set up camp. The ground was cold and hard, and the air was biting, a sharp contrast to the warmth of the day. I tried to start a fire, but the wood was damp, and my hands were trembling too much to get the kindling to catch. I gave up after a few failed attempts, wrapping myself in my jacket and huddling inside my sleeping bag for warmth. The night was long and terrifying. The forest was alive with sounds that I couldn't identify, strange creaks and groans that seemed to come from all around me. The wind whispered through the trees, carrying with it the faint scent of decay, and every now and then I would hear something moving in the underbrush nearby. My imagination ran wild, conjuring images of wild animals, of unseen eyes watching me from the shadows. I clutched my flashlight like a lifeline, its being my only defense against the encroaching darkness. At one point during the night, I heard a loud crack, like the sound of a tree branch breaking. I sat up, my heart racing, and shone my flashlight in the direction of the noise. The beam revealed nothing but trees and shadows, but I knew something had been there. The fear that had been gnawing at the edges of my mind now took hold completely. I was alone, vulnerable, in a place that no longer felt safe. The hours dragged on, each minute stretching into an eternity. I must have dozed off at some point, though my sleep was restless, filled with strange dreams and the cold that seemed to seep into my very bones. I woke several times during the night, each time to the same oppressive darkness, the same unsettling sounds of the forest. The fear was relentless, a constant presence that wouldn't let me rest. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the first light of dawn began to filter through the trees. The darkness slowly lifted, replaced by a pale grey light that brought with it a sense of relief. The forest, so menacing in the dark, began to look familiar again. The trees were just trees, the shadows just shadows. The terror of the night began to fade, replaced by a determination to find my way out. With the first light of morning, I packed up my things and started walking. The trail was still difficult to follow, but the daylight made it easier to navigate. The fear that had gripped me during the night was still there, but it was tempered by the knowledge that I was no longer in complete darkness, that I could find my way back. After several hours of walking, I finally stumbled upon the main trail. Relief washed over me as I recognized the familiar markers, the path leading back to where I had started. The forest had let me go. I had survived the night, faced my fears, and come out the other side. When I finally emerged from the forest, the sun was high in the sky, and the world was bright and warm again. I was exhausted, both physically and mentally, but I had made it through the night. The experience had changed me, made me realize just how small and fragile we are in the grand scheme of things. The forest, for all its beauty and serenity, was a place of raw power, a place where the line between life and death was thin. As I drove away from the trailhead, I couldn't help but look back at the forest one last time. It stood there, silent and unchanged, as if waiting for the next person to venture into its depths. I knew I would return someday, but I would do so with a newfound respect for the wilderness, for the power of nature, and for the strength I had found within myself during that long, terrifying night alone in the forest. The experience had been harrowing, but it had also been a lesson, a reminder that nature is not something to be taken lightly, that it demands respect and humility from those who venture into its depths. The forest is beautiful, yes, but it is also wild, and it is in that wildness that its true power lies. In the days and weeks that followed, I found myself reflecting on the experience more and more. The fear, the isolation, the sense of being at the mercy of something far larger and more powerful than myself, all of it had left a deep impression on me. I realized that the forest had shown me something about myself, about my own limits and my own resilience. It had forced me to confront my fears in a way that I never had before, and in doing so, it had changed me. I began to see the forest in a new light, not just as a place of beauty and peace, but as a place of danger and challenge as well. It was a place where the rules of the modern world didn't apply, where the only things that mattered were survival and respect for the forces of nature. It was a place that demanded humility, a recognition that we are not the masters of the world, but a part of it, subject to its laws and its power. The next time I ventured into the forest, I did so with a greater sense of preparation and awareness. I brought more supplies, took better note of my surroundings, and made sure to respect the wilderness in a way I hadn't before. But I also went with a deeper appreciation for the lessons the forest had taught me. The night I spent alone in the forest was one of the most terrifying experiences of my life, but it was also one of the most profound. It reminded me of the strength I didn't know I had, of the power of nature, and of the thin line that separates us from the wild. The forest, with all its beauty and danger, will always hold a special place in my heart. It is a place where I have found peace, where I have been tested, and where I have learned more about myself than I ever thought possible. The night I spent alone in the forest was a reminder of the wildness that lies just beyond the edge of our everyday lives, a wildness that is both terrifying and exhilarating, and one that I will never forget.